Claude responded. I raised my coffee cup to my lips, and my hand was steady. I raised my coffee cup to my lips, and my hand was steady. That's the thing nobody tells you about the moment your world ends. Your hands don't shake. Not at first. My son-in-law was 3 feet away, giving a toast to 80 guests under the pergola lights in my backyard. And my daughter had just gripped my wrist under the table and whispered 4 words that I will hear until the day I die. Dad, he's not real. Let me back up, because you deserve to understand how a retired homicide detective, a man who spent 31 years reading liars for a living, ended up standing in his own backyard with his heart trying to climb out of his throat while a stranger toasted to family. I'm Frank Doyle. I'm 66 years old, and before you get comfortable, I want to tell you that fictional elements have been woven into this story for narrative purposes. Names and details have been changed, but the lesson underneath it, that lesson is as real as anything I've ever lived. Tell me, whoever's watching this with me tonight, where are you joining from? I read every single comment. It matters to me more than you know. I spent 3 decades with the Sacramento Police Department, most of it in homicide. The last 9 years running a cold case unit out of a converted storage room that smelled like old coffee and older paper. My wife, Carol, used to say I brought the job home with me even when I left my badge on the dresser. She wasn't wrong. You don't spend that many years sitting across from people who've done terrible things and learn nothing about how liars carry themselves. You learn everything. You learn that the ones who are lying to you are almost always the ones who look you dead in the eye and never blink first. Carol passed 18 months ago. Ovarian cancer, caught late, the way it usually is. We had 34 years together, and the last 4 months of that were spent in a hospice room in Roseville with a window that looked out over a parking lot, because that's the room they had. And by then, neither of us cared about the view. Our daughter, Meredith, flew in from Denver every other weekend during those final months, and on the nights she couldn't be there, she called Carol every evening at 7 o'clock sharp, because that was the hour Carol always felt strongest. Meredith is 33. She's a pediatric nurse, works the hardest floor in the hospital, and watching her sit beside her mother's bed those last weeks, holding a hand that was getting lighter every day, was the hardest thing I've ever watched in a life that's shown me plenty of hard things. 3 days before Carol died, she had 1 clear hour. The nurses said that happens sometimes. A window right at the end where the fog lifts and the person you love comes back to you whole for just a little while. Carol used that hour to make me promise 2 things. The first was easy. Stop working. Sell the consulting contracts. Go fishing on the weekends like you always said you would. I promised, and I meant it, and I kept it. The second promise took me over a year to understand. Frank, she said, and her voice had gone thin, but her grip on my hand hadn't. You've spent your whole career finding the one detail that doesn't fit. Promise me you won't stop doing that, especially with Meredith, especially when it's someone she loves. I told her I didn't understand. She just squeezed my hand tighter and said, "You will." 3 days later, she was gone, and I spent the better part of a year rebuilding a life that didn't have her in it, one quiet evening at a time, casting a line into the American River and not catching much of anything, which was fine, because that was never really the point. Then, last October, Meredith called me on a Tuesday night, and I heard something in her voice I hadn't heard since before her mother got sick. "Hope, Dad, I need to tell you something," she said, and the words tumbled out of her in a rush the way they do when someone's been sitting on good news too long to hold it in politely. I met someone. His name is Adrian Voss. We met at a continuing education conference in Chicago. He was there giving a talk on hospital supply chain consulting. Dad, he's smart, and he's kind, and he actually listens. My chest did something complicated. Joy, plain and real, because my daughter had spent 2 years since a bad breakup, pouring every ounce of herself into 12-hour shifts, and had earned every bit of happiness the world owed her. And underneath that joy, quiet as a held breath, the old instinct stirred, the one that fires when a story sounds a little too clean. I pressed it down, because that's what a good father does before he does anything else. "Tell me about him," I said, keeping my voice easy. Adrian Voss, she told me, was 41, ran an independent healthcare logistics consulting firm out of Phoenix, no permanent office, worked directly with hospital systems on supply chain contracts. He'd never been married. He grew up somewhere in the Midwest, she said, though when I asked which state exactly, she realized she didn't actually know. Independent consultant. No firm to call. No colleagues to verify a story against. Never married at 41. In 31 years of homicide work, I'd learned that a man that age, with that profile, fell into one of a small number of categories, and not many of them were good. I told myself I was doing what Carol always accused me of, carrying the job home. I told her I was happy for her, and I meant that too. Both things true at once, the way they so often are. He came to the house 6 weeks later for dinner. Tall, dark-haired, the kind of easy handshake that makes strangers comfortable in 4 seconds flat. He brought a bottle of bourbon, expensive enough to show he'd done his homework. Not so expensive it looked like he was trying too hard. He called me Detective Doyle before I'd told him my rank, which meant he'd looked me up. We grilled in the backyard. He asked good questions about my old cases, not the morbid curiosity most people have, but specific, structural questions, the kind you'd ask if you'd actually worked adjacent to law enforcement somewhere in your career. He talked about his consulting work with just enough vague specificity to sound credible and just enough vagueness to be unverifiable. 2 hospital systems in Arizona. Confidentiality agreements, of course. He never stumbled, never searched for a word. Every answer connected cleanly to the last one, like a man reciting testimony he'd rehearsed until the seams disappeared. That's what worried me most. In 3 decades of interrogation rooms, the truth almost never comes out smooth. Deception is the thing that gets rehearsed. At one point, his phone buzzed, and he excused himself, walked to the edge of the patio, and turned his back to us. I watched his shoulders. They pulled in tight, the posture of a man receiving orders, not a man soothing a nervous client. His free hand cut through the air, twice, sharp, the gesture of someone giving instructions. Then he turned and caught me watching, and in under a second his whole body reset, shoulders loose, face easy, the performance sliding back into place, like a mask clicking shut. "Sorry about that," he said, smiling. "Client emergency. Always something." "I know how that goes," I said, and refilled his glass, and said nothing else. Later, after his taillights disappeared down our street, Meredith found me on the porch. "Well?" she asked, in the voice of someone who already knows the answer doesn't matter to her but needs to hear it anyway. "He's impressive," I told her, and I meant it. She hugged me hard and went inside, and I sat alone a long time with Carol's voice in my head. Trust, but verify, Frank. I was still working on the second half. By March, Adrian had become part of our lives, the way certain things creep into a house one visit at a time, until you look up and realize he has a drawer at Meredith's apartment and a standing invitation to my Sunday dinners. He helped me replace a section of fence in my backyard without being asked. He learned the names of my 2 dogs. He sat with me after dinner and asked about my old cases with what looked, to anyone else, like genuine fascination. When Meredith told me his parents wanted to drive up from Reno to meet us, I said yes before I'd fully thought it through. Gerald and Linda Voss arrived on a Saturday in a clean, unremarkable sedan, dressed like people who did honest, ordinary work and didn't need to announce it. Gerald was 68, a retired civil engineer, the kind of man who glances at your roofline the way other men glance at a menu. Linda was 64, warm-eyed, quick with a story, the kind of woman who makes you feel welcomed within 30 seconds flat. They brought homemade apple butter. Linda told Meredith about Adrian's childhood, a summer spent trying to rebuild a lawnmower engine in the garage. Never did get it running. The kind of story that had clearly been told and retold until it came out polished and warm and exactly the right length. Gerald talked about 40 years with the Nevada Department of Transportation. Not one detail contradicted another. Not one story needed correcting. Not one moment of the ordinary friction that exists in every real family. The gentle interruption. The "no, that's not how it happened." The embellishment that changes slightly every time. They moved through the afternoon with the smooth, rehearsed consistency of people who had reviewed their material. Afterward, Gerald walked with me through my yard while the women cleared the table. Adrian talks about Meredith the way a man talks about something he intends to keep. He told me, man to man, father to father, My chest ached with something I couldn't name, gratitude tangled up with a low, persistent unease, the exact sensation of being told precisely what you want to hear by someone who seems to know precisely what that is. That night, driving home from dropping off leftovers, I passed my own garage and saw Adrian standing near the side door, phone to his ear, back to me, voice low and clipped, nothing like the warm, easy tone he used at my dinner table. "I already told you," he was saying, sharp enough to carry. "Stop asking me about the timeline. It's handled." Not a man managing a difficult client. A man giving orders he expected to be obeyed. I stood in the dark until he ended the call, then walked back to my truck before he saw me. 3 weeks before the engagement party, on a Sunday morning, Meredith needed to check a drug interaction for a patient before her Monday shift, and Adrian's laptop was open on his kitchen table while he showered. She used it the way you use someone's laptop when you've decided to trust them completely and trust has made you careless. 4 tabs were open, 3 were nothing. The 4th was a spreadsheet titled MV, Estate, Transfer, XLSX, MV, Meredith Voss. The name she'd have after the wedding. She opened it. Column A, Assets. My house and the rental property Carol and I had bought in 2003. Appraised value, $1.8 million. My pension and investment accounts, $2.1 million. A trust I'd set up for Meredith when she turned $3,600,000. Total at the bottom, $4.6 million. Exact figures, not estimates, the kind of precision that requires bank statements and legal filings. Weeks of quiet research, not guesswork. Column B, outlined mechanisms. Power of attorney modification, joint account designation. Beneficiary change on the trust, requiring only the current trustee's signature, and Meredith had been sole trustee since her 30th birthday, meaning a husband added after marriage would carry equal legal authority to move funds. No questions asked by any bank processing what looked like a routine trustee transaction. Column C was a timeline, a 21-day window following the wedding, described in the spreadsheet with a phrase that stopped her cold: before any party can challenge the transfer. You don't write a sentence like that if what you're planning is legitimate. You write it if you're racing a clock only you can see. She heard the shower shut off. She closed the laptop. Her hands, she told me later, were shaking so badly she nearly knocked it off the table. She carried it alone for 3 weeks. Not because she didn't trust me, because she was terrified of being wrong, of accusing a man she loved, and destroying everything on a spreadsheet that might have some innocent explanation she simply hadn't found yet. She went through every possible innocent explanation. None of them survived contact with that one sentence. Before any party can challenge the transfer. She told me everything the morning after the engagement party, standing in my backyard in the gray early light, her jaw so tight I could see the muscle working in her cheek. But I need to take you back to that party first, because that's where this story actually turns. 80 guests filled my backyard that April evening, string lights strung between the oak trees Carol had planted the year we bought the house, caterers moving through the crowd, the low hum of people who have stopped being polite and started being comfortable. Adrian stood near the center of it all, his arm around Meredith's waist, and at 7:40 he tapped his glass and rose to give a toast. "When I met Meredith," he said, voice warm and rehearsed and completely convincing, "I understood that sometimes, if you're patient enough, you get exactly what you've been working toward." The room laughed and raised their glasses. I raised mine too, and thought about how right he was, in a way he had no idea I understood, because 3 weeks earlier, my daughter had come to me with that spreadsheet, and I had made a decision that went against every fatherly instinct I owned. We were not going to confront him, not yet. If we tip him off, I told her that first morning in the yard, he disappears before we can prove anything, and he does this to someone else's daughter next. We build the case first, then we move. "How long?" she'd asked, her hands balled into fists. "As long as it takes." So at 8:47 that night, I noted the time, an old habit that never left me. Meredith crossed the yard to where I stood near the fence line, wrapped both hands around my arm the way she used to when she was 7 years old and had a secret, and put her lips to my ear. "Dad, he's not real," she breathed. "None of it's real." Then she stepped back, smiled at a passing guest, and walked straight back to Adrian's side, slipping her hand into his like nothing in the world was wrong. 3 weeks of practice had made her extraordinary at hiding what she carried. I stood there with an untouched glass of bourbon and felt those 4 words land in my chest like something dropped from a great height. For the next hour, I was the father of the bride-to-be. I shook hands. I told stories. I laughed at the right moments. And underneath every word, my mind ran the way it used to run during the hardest interrogations of my career, cold, fast, sorting through everything I knew and everything I needed to find out. The next morning, in the wet grass by the fence, Meredith told me everything: the laptop, the spreadsheet, the 3 weeks of silent terror, and one more thing she'd seen the night before that I hadn't known about. At the party, Adrian had set his phone face up on the cocktail table while talking to one of her nursing colleagues. A notification lit the screen, a photo confirmation from his camera roll. The thumbnail was small, but she'd caught enough. A legal document, cream-colored paper, the same paper stock I used for my will. He had photographed documents from my home office. I called my old partner from the department, Ray Alvarez, retired now, running a private investigations practice out of Elk Grove that specialized in exactly this kind of thing. Ray had heard 1,000 strange requests in his life, and this one still made him go quiet on the other end of the line. "Frank," he finally said, "if this man is what you're describing, he's done it before. Nobody builds this kind of operation on their first attempt." He was right. It took Ray 6 days to find the truth, and when he called with what he'd found, I sat down on my own porch steps because my legs made that decision before I did. Adrian Voss was not Adrian Voss. His real name was Curtis Bellamy, born in Toledo, Ohio, 43 years old. He'd built the Voss identity 4 years earlier, borrowing pieces of a real man's social security number, a retired accountant in Ohio who'd never once worked in healthcare consulting. 2 years before Meredith, Curtis had run an identical operation in Boise under the name Nathan Pruitt, targeting a rancher's daughter. The rancher's investigator had gotten close enough to spook him, and Curtis had vanished before completing the theft. No money taken, but the pattern was identical down to the spreadsheet and the 21-day window. 18 months before that, in Savannah, under the name Elliot Marsh, he'd run the same operation to completion against a woman named Patricia Kell, daughter of a man named Walter Kell, who'd built a trucking company from a single rig into a 40-truck fleet over 30 years. Curtis had taken $2.3 million. Walter Kell had lost the company within a year trying to cover the hole, lost his house 6 months after that, and 8 months after Curtis disappeared, Walter Kell was found by a park ranger in a state forest outside Savannah, having taken his own life. He left a note in his coat pocket addressed to Patricia. It said he was sorry. It said he'd failed her. "There's one more thing," Ray told me on that call, his voice careful in the way it gets when the next sentence is going to hurt. "Patricia Kell filed a civil complaint after her father died. She's a paralegal now, in Charleston. She spent 3 years hunting the man who did this. Frank, she saw your daughter's engagement announcement in a local paper. She called my office an hour ago. She recognized his face. I called Patricia Kell that same evening. Her voice was 29 years old and carried the weight of someone who'd spent 3 years learning to walk upright under something heavy. I've been 6 months behind him for 3 years. She told me. Until today. You're not behind him anymore, I said. We built the case together over the following 8 weeks myself, Ray, an FBI financial crimes agent out of the Sacramento field office, named Denise Okafor, who took the case the moment she saw the pattern, and Patricia, who provided records from the Georgia investigation that closed gaps we couldn't have closed alone. Curtis's associate turned out to be a woman named Renee Castillo, a former paralegal from an estate planning firm in Reno who prepared every document, every trust modification, every wire authorization, 6 months of email correspondence between them, recovered through a warrant, spelled out the entire operation in language cold enough to freeze blood. Target confirmed. MV. Estimated liquid assets $4.6 million. Trustee since age 30. Clean setup. Even Gerald and Linda Voss turned out to be actors. Paid $4,000 apiece through a talent agency that booked background work. Told only that they were helping surprise a girlfriend's family. One of them, Linda, agreed to testify once she understood what she'd actually been part of. For 8 weeks, Curtis came to my house every weekend, helped me with the fence, sat on my porch, smiled across my dinner table, and every single time, I smiled back. I have never worked harder at anything in my life than I worked at looking like a happy father-in-law to be. The night of the rehearsal dinner at a hotel downtown, I wore a small recorder in my breast pocket. Agent Okafor sat in a support vehicle in the parking structure. When Curtis excused himself from the dinner to take a client call, I gave it 4 minutes, then followed at a distance and stood outside room 412, where Rene Castillo was waiting with the documents. I heard enough through that door to end him. The transfer timeline, the offshore account, the acknowledgement, plain as day, that I had no legal standing to stop any of it. Once the paperwork was filed, I sent one word to Agent Okafor. Now. I could have waited for her team. I didn't. 31 years of needing to see a case land the moment it lands got the better of me, and I knocked. Curtis opened the door, and his face moved through surprise, calculation, and something colder, all in under 2 seconds. Meredith stepped up beside me. "Not anymore," she said, when he started to say her name the way he used to. 60 seconds later, Agent Okafor came through with 2 agents behind her, and it was over. Almost. Because as they walked him out in handcuffs, Curtis stopped, looked back at me, and said something that has stayed lodged in my chest ever since. "You want to know who I am? 15 years ago, you closed a case that put my brother away for 11 years. He died in that facility. You have no idea what you started, Detective Doyle. I searched 31 years of cases in my memory and found it inside a minute. Marcus Bellamy, 2011. Wire fraud against elderly victims in 3 counties. Evidence I'd helped build myself. He died of a cardiac event in year 6 of his sentence. Medical response too slow, too late. I hadn't known he had a brother. Nobody had known. Curtis Bellamy had spent 15 years turning that grief into a weapon. And Rene Castillo, it turned out, was his half-sister. Found through a DNA registry in 2018, bound together by the same absent father who'd walked out on 2 different families and left both of them with nothing. But there was a second name Curtis threw at me on his way out the door. Quieter. Meant only for me. I didn't find your daughter's schedule and your trust paperwork on my own from Phoenix. Someone gave me everything. Someone who knew you before I ever did. Ask yourself who benefits from watching you lose everything, detective. That night, Curtis escaped custody during transport, overpowering a transport officer at a rest stop off Highway 99. The officer survived. A regional manhunt lit up 3 counties, and Agent Okafor called me at 11 that night to tell me to secure my house immediately because Curtis knew exactly where I lived and had nothing left to lose. I found him myself just before midnight, in my own garage, trying to force the combination lock on the small fireproof safe bolted to my workbench floor, the one that held Carol's and my estate documents. His shirt was torn, blood dried above one ear. When the light came on, his eyes had none of the practiced calm left in them. "I just need the account numbers," he said, voice cracking. "I can still get out." "It's over," I told him. "It's been over since Meredith closed that laptop." He came at me, and I put myself between him and the door, the way you do when you've already decided this ends here. And 31 years of training took over, even at 66 years old, with bad knees. I got him to the ground and held him there until 2 deputies came through the garage door. As they pulled him up, he gave me one final name, a retired county judge named Harold Whitfield, a man I had reported to the State Judicial Conduct Board 9 years earlier after uncovering a pattern of paid favors in his courtroom that ended his career and, as it turned out, his marriage and most of his savings in the fallout. Whitfield, investigators later confirmed, had paid Curtis Bellamy $160,000 over 3 years, in 3 installments that lined up precisely with 3 phases of the operation against my family, and had fed him the details about Meredith's schedule and my finances gathered years earlier through old professional relationships with my former attorney, back when trust between colleagues flowed freely and nobody thought to guard it. Whitfield was arrested at his home in Folsom 4 days later. He'd left a handwritten confession on his kitchen table before agents arrived. I wanted Frank Doyle to understand what it feels like to lose everything because of a decision someone else believed was righteous. Curtis Bellamy received 17 years. Rene Castillo received 9. Harold Whitfield, 73 years old, received 8, with no possibility of early release for the first 5. Patricia Kell sat 3 rows behind me at every single sentencing, and when the last one was read, I heard her exhale a breath that sounded like 3 years, finally setting down something heavy. My father would have been glad it was counted, she told me afterward, in the courthouse hallway. Not happy. He wasn't a man who found peace in punishment. But glad. Restitution from the seized accounts went to Patricia's family, and to the others, Ray and Agent Okafor, eventually traced across 4 states. It didn't undo anything, but it named what had been done. And that matters more than people understand, until they've needed it themselves. Meredith took 2 months away from the hospital floor to heal. Walked my backyard most mornings the way her mother used to walk it before she got sick. Went back to therapy twice a week in Denver, and called me most evenings just to hear a familiar voice for 10 minutes before bed. By late summer, she was back to full shifts. And on an ordinary Tuesday in September, she called me with something in her voice I hadn't heard in a long time, the same lightness from the night she first told me about a man named Adrian Voss. Except this time it was real, unpracticed, entirely hers. "There's someone I want you to meet," she said. "His name's Ben Okafor, no relation to the agent, small world. He teaches high school biology. Dad, he asks about my day, and then he actually waits for the answer. I ran a background check anyway. Old habits, clean record, ordinary life, a history that had been lived instead of built." He came to dinner that Sunday, called me Detective Doyle without being told because Meredith had mentioned it and he'd been paying attention, and laughed at her jokes without trying to top them. That evening, after he'd gone home, Meredith found me on the porch and slipped her arm through mine the way she had, since she was small enough to need help down the steps. "I know you ran a background check," she said, laughing. "Old habits," I told her. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for believing me the second I said something was wrong. For not making me carry it alone." I thought about Carol's voice in that hospice room, the one clear hour she had left, and the promise I hadn't understood for over a year. She'd have known what to say to that. She always did. I'm 66 years old, and 31 years of homicide work taught me plenty about how people lie. But it took losing my wife and nearly losing my daughter to a man wearing another man's name to teach me the one lesson that actually matters. That quiet instinct, the one that whispers when something doesn't fit, that isn't paranoia. That's a gift. And the people who love you deserve you paying attention to it just as much as they deserve your trust. Those two things were never opposites. Love without discernment is a door left unlocked, and I nearly left mine open. If this story reached you tonight, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and who taught you to trust your gut? Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and I'll be back soon with another story. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. Claude responded, "The gut feeling that whispers something's off isn't paranoia, it's love paying close attention." The gut feeling that whispers something's off isn't paranoia, it's love paying close attention. A father's quiet watchfulness saved his daughter, not because he doubted her, but because he refused to stop noticing the small things. That's the real gift we owe the people we love. Not blind trust, not suspicion, but the steady kind of care that keeps its eyes open even when everything looks perfect. A small note for you. This story was written and fictionalized by AI for entertainment purposes, while still hoping to carry a genuine, positive life lesson to you.